Welcome. I think that's everyone from the waiting room. I'm sure there'll be a few people joining us as we get going, but it is 10 a.m., so might as well get started. Just a reminder that the presentation portion of our session today will be recorded for future uses. If you do not wish to appear in the recording, just turn off your camera and remember to remain muted while the presentation is ongoing. If you have questions or comments, you can always use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll look at those when we get back to that portion. I'm going to apologize. My voice is a little raspy. My nose is a little plugged. I'm getting over a cold. So I might need to pause for a cough here and there. But I'm sure everyone can relate to the season and everything. So first of all, my name is Meredith, and I work at the Western Development Museum in Saskatchewan. I'm a programs coordinator here. And thank you everyone for joining us from around the province. Dave is joining us as well from Saskatoon, although he's down the road at our corporate office. He's going to be helping with the technical side of the presentation, and he'll also be looking at the chat I mentioned. So if you have questions or comments, or you'd like to share a memory or something that sparks something, just note those in the chat, and we'll get back to those at the end of the presentation. We are happy to be on Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, and Dakota people, and the traditional homeland of the Métis. And we also love to recognize Whitecap Dakota First Nation, which is just down the street from us. They are not Treaty 6 signatories, and they have their own relationship with the Crown. And the WDM is committed to working towards a new relationship anchored in the spirit of treaties and to educating Saskatchewan people about their shared history of treaty making. So I was also mentioning, if you have any comments or questions that come up while we're going through the presentation, you can always put those in the chat, and we will look at those at the end of the presentation. Or like Doris so briefly did, let us know if there's any technical issues in the chat as well. So I was saying we have 4 locations here. We have also our corporate office in Saskatchewan, which serves as a sort of collections warehouse for all of our artifacts that are not on display. Our Yorkton Museum tells the story of people through immigration and settlement in the last 100 years. The WDM Battle has an outdoor settler village and a working farm. The museum in Saskatchewan here has our largest, and it houses a 1910 boom town right inside the building. And of course, Moose Jaw's theme is transportation history in our province. So at the WDM, we love to hear and share stories about Saskatchewan. Our vision is a Saskatchewan where everyone belongs and histories matter. It specifically says histories matter because history is not just one story. Today, we are going to talk about when first Saskatchewan women gained the right to vote. But not all women were included at the time. We're also going to talk about Violet McNaughton, one of many women who fought for women's rights in our province. Their stories are important, and so are yours. At the end of the presentation, I'd love to hear more about your experiences and stories. On March 14, 1916, Saskatchewan became only the 2nd province in Canada to grant some women the right to vote. While it's easy to look back now and assume it was inevitable that women would have such a fundamental right, in reality, this monumental day in Canadian human rights history was the result of tireless work by women for women. And a lot of this work was done by Violet McNaughton. The work Violet did to advance gender equality for settler women in Saskatchewan left a legacy still felt today. Not only was Violet a public face for the Saskatchewan campaign for women's suffrage or the right to vote, she also fought for women's rights to own their property, to be recognized for the work they did on the family farm, and to stand for elected office. By the time she passed away in Saskatoon in 1968 at the age of 89, Violet had spent 6 decades fighting for the rights of Saskatchewan women. In the fall of 1909, just 30 years old, Violet Clara Jackson, a native of Kent, England, stepped off a train at the Canadian Pacific Railway Station in Harris, Saskatchewan. She was only 4'11", the result of having suffered rickets as a child. However, this, along with her will and desire for change, led some to call her the mighty Violet of Saskatchewan farm politics. From Harris, the family, Violet, her brother and father, traveled to the homestead in the Hillview Farming District, southwest of Saskatoon. Violet had read about the 4-year-old province of Saskatchewan in immigration literature back home in the old country. The information was hard to miss. Posters and pamphlets encouraging enterprising young men to begin a new life in the seemingly shimmering wheat fields of Britain's largest and nearest colony were everywhere. Through these promotional materials, the story of the land of milk and honey, where ready-made farms awaited new arrivals, was told. Immigration propaganda not only presented an unrealistic ideal of the prairie landscape, but also idealized assumptions and expectations about gender. The role of women in this model scenario was a farm wife and mother, dutifully feeding her husband after a long day in the fields and tending to the children that would provide the next generation of farm laborers the federal government so desired. The potential of a new life where you could be your own boss, own your own land, and have every need for food and shelter met was alluring in a time before the mass development of labor unions, workers' protection, and government-funded welfare programs. People flocked to Saskatchewan by the tens of thousands, looking for homesteads. For most, the view out the window of the railway station provided the first realistic glimpse at their home. Though Violet would come to be known as one of the most influential actors in women's rights in Canada, she began her life in Saskatchewan much like other settlers. She left her teaching career in England to immigrate with her father and brother, and initially lived with them on her brother's homestead near Harris, Saskatchewan. And here's a photo. You can see Violet in the back row with her students in Kent. By her own admission, Violet's upbringing in Britain had been radical. She already identified as feminist by the time she arrived in Canada. Her grandfather was a founding member of one of the UK's first cooperatives, established to bring food and water to families of dock workers. Her parents were deeply involved in the labor movement in the UK and raised their children to believe in the power and value of the working class. She had a lifelong admiration of rebels and those who bucked social norms, and was rebellious herself. Having come of age as restrictive ideas of the Victorian period faded away and the Edwardian period began, Violet saw herself as embodying new ideas for a new century. Violet sought a life where it was easier to make meaningful change and live on one's own terms, values she had seen expressed by those immigration posters. Despite her radical ideas, she also intricately understood the challenges of rural life from her childhood in the English countryside. In May of 1910, less than a year after arriving in Saskatchewan, Violet married John McNaughton, a homesteader of Scottish descent from New Zealand, also from the Hillview area. And here's a photo of Violet with John and with the brother. The McNaughtons understood how much a husband and wife needed each other to run a successful grain farm in the early 20th century Saskatchewan. Beyond agriculture, John was to become Violet's most passionate and lifelong supporter. The McNaughtons had an egalitarian marriage that was not yet common in the early 20th century. John championed Violet in the many social causes she adopted throughout her life. In the opening years of the 20th century, Saskatchewan was predominantly a rural society. Through to the 1930s, more than 60% of Saskatchewan's population would live on a farm. The triumphs and challenges of life on the family farm were the defining factors for most residents of Saskatchewan, including Violet. Violet came to Saskatchewan with an independence of spirit that served her well as a farm wife in the early 20th century. So here we can see Violet hauling water on a stone boat, so driving the team, being very involved in the farm chores. She believed that the work women contributed to society, though different in nature, was no less essential than the work men did. She also strongly identified as a member of the working class. She maintained both of these beliefs throughout her life. Violet was disappointed to realize upon arriving in Saskatchewan that prairie agriculture had already been constructed as a male endeavor that relied on the subordination of women. Despite the way farming had been socially constructed in Western Canada, it was clear that the survival of the family farm depended on the work women did. Throughout the 19th century, women in North America and Europe had no independent legal existence from their husbands. The fact that women refer to themselves almost exclusively as Mrs. husband's first name and last name demonstrated this reality, as well as the fact that they could not own property or farms. Violet herself was often introduced as Mrs. John McNaughton at public events and in writing. In 1872, the Dominion Lands Act, federal legislation that governed the settlement of the West and the homestead process in Saskatchewan, banned single women from applying for homesteads. The federal government wanted the agricultural paradise they envisioned for Western Canada to reflect strong heteronormative family values: one man, one woman, and inevitably children. The Minister of the Department of the Interior, Frank Oliver, noted that he was often asked whether he had considered permitting ladies the privilege of homesteading. His reply was that the purpose in giving free land to homesteaders is that the land may be made productive. Giving homesteads to single women would tend directly against that idea. If a woman wanted to settle on land in the Northwest, Oliver advised she should get herself a husband. After a short time in Saskatchewan, Violet had realized that she was not, in fact, living in the Golden West. The living conditions that welcomed Saskatchewan's first settlers were at odds with what was presented in immigration literature. Rather than ready-made farms seen on posters, many settlers arrived to find land that required back-breaking work to clear before a crop could even be seeded. Nor had they realized how dependent on the weather agriculture and life on Canadian prairies would be. Early frost sometimes destroyed crops. Also, the immigration posters had somehow left out -40 degrees in winter. There was little lumber to be found locally out of which a house could be built. Many settlers spent their first Saskatchewan winters in sod houses or soddies. And here we can see a photo of John and Violet in front of their soddies. They were small, cramped structures where an entire family lived in 2 or 3 rooms, made out of slabs of dirt from the settlers' own land and placed on top of each other. Life in a sod house left a lot to be desired. There was no electricity, no running water, limited space for a growing family, and the walls were not airtight to the elements. Snakes, insects, and mice were common visitors in a sod house. Violet and her husband lived in their soddy for 14 years. Describing their first home together, Violet stated, "It leaked in 13 places, and we started with apple boxes for chairs and a homemade bed, and not much else. The roof was timber-lined, covered with sod, but as the sod rotted, it leaked in heavy rains. It took every pot and pan we had of any size to catch the water. I recall going to sleep with an umbrella held slanted over the bed." I can just picture that. For most women, early settler life equated to what Violet herself would later refer to as endless drudgery. We can look at the next slide to see an image that might spark that kind of some thoughts. That looks a little bit like endless drudgery to me. They were completely unprepared for the superhuman feats of endurance needed to survive the new landscape. The process of washing and drying clothes took 2 full days. The use of the manual washboard made their hands so raw they would bleed and become infected. Women cooked everything for their families. This was a time long before ready meals and microwaves. Everything was made from scratch. For many families, there was often not enough food, and some were affected by malnutrition. Women milked cows and tended to chickens. Women planted and harvested gardens. They spun and knit their own wool to make clothes for their families. Women often did all this work while heavily pregnant. Hard work, tenacity, and grit became badges of honor for Saskatchewan farm women, while at the same time, the constant labor they performed ruined their health and often contributed to early death. Despite all of this back-breaking work, an early government census unjustly referred to farm wives as having no occupation. Violet herself had strong thoughts on why women's work was less socially valued than men's, and believed men themselves to contribute to this idea. Referring to men who thought that a woman's place was in the home, she stated, "He is placing his wife on a lower place than himself. I have sometimes asked a man in the slack season why his wife does not come out instead for once, and he will say, 'Oh, I never mind the children.' This and other remarks give me the impression that he has unconsciously placed his wife on the level of his brood mare." Violet and other women like her realized that conditions for farm life for early settlers needed to be improved. Violet came to believe Western Canada had been exploited by Eastern Canadian elites and had never been given a fair chance. So they began to organize and to do something about it. Violet was instrumental in founding one of the most influential farm advocacy groups in Canadian history, the Women Grain Growers Association. And here we can see a photo of all the members of the Women's Grain Growers Association in 1914. And the WGGA not only became very powerful, but it was the first of its kind created specifically for women. The WGGA was founded as a partner organization to the Saskatchewan Grain Growers Association, and we can see a picture of their assembly in the next slide. They were a very powerful agricultural lobbyist group, which initially maintained a male-only membership. The WGGA was vital in advancing the causes and concerns of farm women, and it was created because women advocated for it. The women of the WGGA were a strong force in both the kinds of social services they organized and how quickly they organized them. If we look at the next slide, we can see a quilt that was a fundraiser for the WGGA. I thought this is this is a quilt that we actually have in our collection. And each name that's pictured on there was a donation. So that was a fundraiser, and then it would be raffled to be given. It's a really cool example of their ingenuity, using their skills to raise money. They helped to secure their own futures through legislation, like an amendment to the Saskatchewan Homestead Act in 1927. This gave wives the right to prevent the sale or mortgage of their home quarter without their signatures. I can't imagine my farm being sold out from underneath it. This built on the progress made in 1919 with the Devolution of Estates Act. This act guaranteed widows from 33 to 100% of their husband's estates. The Saskatchewan women now had protection against being left homeless and penniless. They also performed critical community building activities at a local level, like organizing community libraries and clothing drives. Violet's work for farm women and children became so well known that she would eventually be named the first president of the women's section of the Canadian Council of Agriculture. In the 1910s and 1920s, the Women's Grain Growers Association took the charge in leading Saskatchewan women through an exciting time in history, one full of promise for the future, the brightest beacon on the horizon being the vote. Western Canadian women were the first in Canada to obtain the right to vote, a right they organized early and fought hard for. Manitoba was the first province to grant some women the right to vote in January 1916. And 2 months later, Saskatchewan followed, and also Alberta, with their leads granting some women the franchise. Eastern Canadians definitely took notice of the progressive West's early acknowledgement of the franchise for women and looked to the examples set by the Western provinces to organize their own suffrage movements. In the Saskatchewan of the early 20th century, many different women's groups fought for the right to vote. Though they shared the same mission of gaining the franchise for women, each of these groups had a different goal and viewed the role of women in society differently. One of the largest, most visible groups to lobby for women's suffrage was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU. Members of the WCTU observed firsthand the destructive effects of alcohol on family life, the abuse, abandonment, and poverty that alcoholism could cause. They believed that society enabled men to spend more time drinking at bars than at home providing for their families. The WCTU saw temperance as a way of guaranteeing a more stable society. Their end goal was to make the sale of alcohol illegal in Saskatchewan. They believed that if women had the vote and could use it to ban alcohol, they would have more influence over how their households were managed, how children were raised, and how money was spent. Many members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union also believed that only a certain kind of woman should be granted the vote: white, English-speaking, of British heritage, and preferably middle or upper class. The Women's Grain Growers Association, however, of which Violet was president, recognized the importance of drumming up as much support for women's suffrage as possible and welcomed immigrant women of Eastern European backgrounds into their numbers. Violet herself supported the inclusion of these women in the suffrage movement, saying, "The WGGA had a part to play in our duty to the so-called foreign woman, who, like ourselves, are now citizens." Though the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Women's Grain Grower Association worked closely together on gaining the vote, they remained different in terms of their view of women's place in the world. In December 1916, a province-wide referendum was held on the topic of liquor prohibition. The question posed to voters was whether prohibition should be permanent or whether a licensing system should be reestablished. This was the first such referendum in a young province's history, and the first time women voters weighed in on an issue affecting the law in their province. 80% of voters voted to ban alcohol in the province. In 1915, Violet founded the Saskatchewan Equal Franchise Board, with members from many different women's groups, with the common goal of women's suffrage. After a long and grueling cross-province trek in which they traveled over rough terrain where roads had not yet been built and the weather did not cooperate, they collected 10,000 signatures in support of women's suffrage. These signatures were organized into a petition that was presented before the Saskatchewan Legislative Assembly in Premier Walter Scott in February 1916. A month later, Saskatchewan became the second Canadian province to grant some women the right to vote. Saskatchewan women first voted provincially in the election in 1917. The first Canadian women received the franchise federally in 1918 under Prime Minister Robert Borden. There's a popular notion today that in Saskatchewan that there was not much resistance to granting women the vote, in part because the government and Premier Walter Scott wanted Saskatchewan to be known across Canada as the most progressive province. While the Premier may have considered himself progressive, widespread social attitudes and the law were not. In February 23rd, 1913 edition of the Grain Grower's Guide depicts this cartoon we can see here. It shows Premier Walter Scott dangling a paper with the word vote on it in front of the nose of a woman who was on her knees begging like a dog. Premier Scott did not champion women's suffrage, but instead waited until women themselves demanded it. Scott used delay tactics so that he and the provincial Liberal Party did not feel forced to take a strong position in support of suffrage. The text of the Dominion Elections Act said, "No woman, idiot, lunatic, or criminal shall vote," clearly conveying that only able-bodied men possessed the innate logic and reason needed to vote. Many people, women and men, believed that giving women the vote would lead to a breakdown of marriages and households and the neglect of children. Such beliefs suggested that women would use their vote as a tool to justify abandoning their roles as wife and mother in favor of pursuing educational and economic opportunities outside. Violet did not believe such rhetoric considered the untapped intelligence, abilities, and unique social perspectives of women, nor did it take into account the reality that prairie women had been both working on the farm and caring for their household and children for years. In response to such laws and policies, Violet responded that a large segment of men who had the vote did not use it. Did that make them unfit voters? Violet insisted that women would vote just as men did. Some would vote well, others would vote poorly, and others still would not use it at all. It's also important to acknowledge that powerful all-male lobbyist groups like the Saskatchewan Grain Growers Association primarily wanted to give women the vote because they believed women would support their men in voting. The new women voters would therefore support agricultural causes, meaning the Saskatchewan Grain Growers Association was not acting purely out of desire for either gender equality. This was a way of amplifying the voices of farmers, which the federal government had not paid much attention to at a national level. Though many Saskatchewan farm women lived in a world where their fathers, brothers, and husbands viewed them as equal partners in the struggle to yield a successful crop, women nevertheless occupied a lesser rung on the social hierarchy at this time, where they were simply not valued as men. Not as valued as men. This is a letter here from Premier Scott congratulating the Women's Grain Growers Association on their receiving the franchise. It's important in any discussion of the franchise to mention who was left out in what we often regard to be a history-defining change. Well, on March 14, 1916, it will go down in history as a momentous day for some Saskatchewan women. Many others would be left waiting for decades to enjoy the same right. The women who gained the right to vote in 1916 were primarily like Violet, white and of British descent. Though Violet was not, many women were middle to upper class and property owners. Many more were excluded from the vote due to their race or cultural background. It is for this reason we are careful to add some when we talk about some women getting the vote. Indigenous people, for example, waited 42 years before having the right to vote provincially and federally without losing their status and treaty rights. It wouldn't be until 1960. Saskatchewan's national reputation is often linked to the advent of Medicare. We are the home of Tommy Douglas and the first ever universal health care program in North America. But years before Tommy, there was Violet. As early as 1914, she had advocated for significant health reforms that were eventually passed by the provincial legislature, such as the creation of district nurses and free public health clinics. However, Violet was most concerned about the immediate and longer-term effects of lack of access to health care on prairie women. In the Canada of Violet's time, childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. A 1925 statistic tells us that every day more than 4 Canadian women died from childbirth. The condition in which Saskatchewan farm women gave birth magnified existing dangers. At this time, most still gave birth at home. The vast majority of farm women lived far from a doctor, or even further from a hospital, meaning help did not arrive in time if it was needed, or if the family could even afford it in an era before universal health care. Their homes often did not have running water or electricity and lacked the sanitized environment ideal for giving birth. Like endangering infections and hemorrhaging were both very common. Apart from childbirth, women often have few options for other gynecological services necessary for their well-being. In 1911, Violet herself underwent an emergency hysterectomy in Saskatchewan. She stayed in the city for several weeks as the surgeon did not deem her strong enough upon arrival to undergo an operation. So she spent a month building up her strength. The operation affected her so dramatically that she suffered issues with poor health for 5 years afterwards. This impacted her ability to assist with manual labor and daily operations on the farm. The operation completely altered the course of Violet's life, as it left her unable to have children. This provided her with an increased time for participating in social causes. Violet was an advocate for the right of every woman, including farm women, to proper antenatal care, and helped to pass an act supporting the necessity of community midwives in the Hillview area. In 1926, Violet started writing a column called Mainly for Women in the Western Producer newspaper. Though already enforced in Canadian farm movement, Violet began her journalistic career, like many other women at the time, as an unpaid volunteer who felt unsure of herself and her skills. Nevertheless, journalism was one of the most powerful tools of Western Canada's early feminists, and Violet was able to be one of the most prolific writers of her time. She would remain on the staff of the Producer for 25 years, where she eventually rose to the position of women's editor. She used her pen to shed light on critical issues facing women that other media outlets of her time viewed as taboo or were unwilling to discuss. She and John eventually found an apartment in Saskatchewan so she could write for the newspaper full-time, and she would later accept a salary of $120 per month. Violet's Mainly for Women column was revolutionary for its time in many ways, chiefly in that it provided women a place to confess their real feelings and ask questions not considered proper by the larger society in which they lived. The column gave women a space to express themselves honestly and feel hurt. Thousands of women from across the province wrote to Violet with their hopes and fears, treating her as a trusted confidant, who deeply understood and empathized with them due to her open lived experiences. She in turn offered them comfort and advice, tips and tricks drawn from her own well of hardships and joys of early prairie settler life. Violet wrote in a warm and approachable way that endeared her to her readers and led them to trust her. Many of the letters readers wrote to opened with "Dear Editor and Friends," reinforcing the sense of community women found in columns like Violet's. Violet retired as women's editor of the Western Producer in 1950, but continued to write the column titled Jottings Along the Way for 9 years. Different in tone from her Mainly for Women column, Violet considered this column a stand-in for the memoirs I shall probably never write. Jottings included many personal and autobiographical details about her life. In addition to her political, social, and journalistic achievements, Violet was an early and active member of the Canadian Women's Press Club. When she passed away in Saskatchewan in 1968, they celebrated her life and achievements. In later life, she was also awarded the Order of the British Empire, the precursor to the Order of Canada, for her work in raising awareness and protecting the needs of Canadian farmers, especially women. In 1997, she was named a person of national significance by the federal government. Violet's contributions to Saskatchewan and the gains its women continue to enjoy today, including universal health care, expanded access to birth control, and the right to vote and stand for elected office, are truly too numerous to count. The women of this province owe her an immense debt of gratitude for many of the realities of our daily lives today. In this photo, we can see Violet actually at a pioneer event here at the WDM Saskatchewan. This is a photo in our archive. The ribbon she's wearing says guest speaker. So it's just cool to see that she also participated here at WDM, spreading all of the wonderful knowledge. This wraps up the formal portion of the presentation. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I hope my froggy voice wasn't too irritating. So the next one will be Liz Scott, and that's our chief curator here at the WDM. And it'll be on April 25th. And that will be discussing our Collective Threads. And our Collective Threads is a virtual exhibit that just launched. It was an in-person exhibit, I guess that's the way to say that, a few years ago. And it's looking at how textiles kind of tell the story. And I'm sure Liz will have lots of wonderful things to share with us on that.